evening. I hope everyone's doing well this Sunday night. I hope you are ready for some more King in Yellow from, I can't remember his name, Robert Williams, I think. As a reminder, this book is from 1895. It is old. There are a couple of times that I am changing words to make it more appropriate. And there are a couple of times where it's holds some very outdated ideas, as we saw last stream. So, we'll be continuing today with the second short story in the collection, The Mask. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed? Casilda, indeed, it's time. We have all laid aside disguise but you. Stranger, I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda. No mask? No mask? The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. 1. Although I knew nothing of chemistry, I listened fascinated. He picked up an Easter lily which Genevieve had bought that morning from Notre Dame and dropped it into the basin. Instantly, the liquid lost its crystalline clearness. For a second, the lily was enveloped in a milk-white foam which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through from the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same instant, he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. There is no danger, he explained. If you choose the right moment, that golden ray is the signal. He held the lily toward me, and I took it in my hand. It had turned to stone, to the purest marble. You see, he said, it is without a flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it? The marble was white as snow, but in its depths the veins of the lily were tinged with the palest azure, and a faint flush lingered deep in its heart. Don't ask me the reason of that, he smiled, noticing my wonder. I have no idea why the veins and heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday I tried one of Genevieve's goldfish. There it is. The fish looked as if it sculptured in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautifully veined with a faint blue, and from somewhere within came a rosy light like the tint which slumbers in an opal. I looked into the basin. Once more it seemed filled with the clearest crystal. If I should touch it now? I demanded. I don't know, he replied, but you had better not try. There is one thing I'm curious about, I said, and that is where the ray of sunlight came from. It looked like a sunbeam, true enough, he said. I don't know. It always comes when I immerse any living thing. Perhaps, he continued, smiling, perhaps it is the vital spark of the creature escaping to the source from whence it came. I saw he was mocking, and threatened him with a mahl stick, but he only laughed and changed the subject. Stay to lunch. Genevieve will be here directly. I saw her going to early mass, I said, and she looked as fresh and sweet as that lily before you destroyed it. Do you think I destroyed it? Said Boris gravely. Destroyed? Preserved? How can we tell? He sat in the corner of a studio near his unfinished group of the Fates. He leaned back on the sofa, twirling a sculptor's chisel and squinting at his work. By the way, he said, I have finished pointing up that old academic Ariadne, and I suppose it will have to go to the Salon. It's all I have ready this year, but after the success the Madonna brought me, I feel ashamed to send a thing like that. The Madonna, an exquisite marble for which Genevieve had sat, had been the sensation of last year's Salon. I looked at the Ariadne. It was a magnificent piece of technical work, but I agreed with Boris that the world would expect something better of him than that. Still, it was impossible now to think of finishing in time for the Salon that splendid, terrible group half shrouded in the marble behind me. The Fates would have to wait. We were proud of Boris Yvain. We claimed him, and he claimed us on the strength of his having been born in America, although his father was French and his mother was a Russian. Everyone in the Beaux-Arts called him Boris, and yet there were only two of us whom he addressed in the same familiar way, Jack Scott and myself. Perhaps my being in love with Genevieve had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all was settled, and she told me with tears in her eyes that it was Boris whom she loved, I went over to his house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us, I always believed, although to one at least it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Genevieve ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Genevieve was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus in Gounod's Mass, but I was always glad when she changed that mood for what we called her April maneuvers. She was often as variable as an April day. In the morning, grave, dignified, and sweet. At noon, laughing, capricious. At evening, whatever one least expected. I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna-like tranquillity which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when he spoke again. "What do you think of my discovery, Alec?" "I think it's wonderful." "I shall make no use of it, beyond satisfying my own curiosity so far as may be, and the secret will die with me." "It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography." "It would be rather Boris nodded, playing with the edge of the chisel. "This new, vicious discovery would corrupt the world of art. No, I shall never confide the secret to anyone," he said slowly. It would be hard to find anyone less informed about such phenomena than myself, but of course I had heard of mineral springs so saturated with silica that the leaves and twigs which fell into them were turned to stone after a time. I dimly comprehended the process, how the silica replaced the vegetable matter atom by atom, and this result was a duplicate of the object in stone. This, I confess, had never interested me greatly, and as for the ancient fossils thus produced, they disgusted me. Boris, it appeared, feeling curiosity instead of repugnance, had investigated the subject and had accidentally stumbled on a solution, which, attacking the immersed object with a ferocity unheard of in a second, did the work of years. This was all I could make out of the strange story he had just been telling me. He spoke again after a long silence. "I am almost frightened when I think what I have found. Scientists would go mad over the discovery. It was so simple, too. It discovered itself. When I think of that formula and that new element precipitated in metallic scales—" "What new element?" "Oh, I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't believe I ever shall. There are enough precious metals now in the world to cut throats over." I pricked up my ears. "Have you struck gold, Boris?" "No, better, but see here, Alec," he laughed, starting up. "You and I have all we need in this world. Ah, how sinister and covetous you look already." I laughed too, and told him I was devoured by the desire for gold, and we had better talk of something else, so when Genevieve came in shortly after, we had turned our backs on alchemy. Genevieve was dressed in silvery gray from head to foot. The light glinted along the soft curves of her fair hair as she turned her cheeks to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and I promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before it had touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, "You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon." This also was something new. She had always asked me herself until today. "I did," said Boris shortly. "And you said yes, I hope." She turned to me with a charming, conventional smile. I might have been an acquaintance of the day before yesterday. I made her a low bow. "J'avais bien l'honneur, madame." But refusing to take up our usual bantering tone, she murmured a hospitable commonplace and disappeared. Boris and I looked at one another. "I'd better go home, don't you think?" I asked. "Hanged if I know," he replied frankly. While we were discussing the advisability of my departure, Genevieve reappeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her color was too deep, and her lovely eyes were too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. "Luncheon is ready. Was I cross, Alec? I thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris." And she slipped her other arm through his. "Alec knows that after you there is no one in the world whom I like as well as I like him, so if he sometimes feels snubbed, it won't hurt him." "Ah, la bonne heure!" I cried. "Who says there are no thunderstorms in April?" "Are you ready?" chanted Boris. "Aye, ready." And arm in arm we raced into the dining room, scandalizing the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Genevieve was 18, Boris was 23, and I not quite 21. 2. Some work that I was doing about this time on the decorations for Genevieve's boudoir kept me constantly at the quaint little hotel in the Rue Saint-Cécile. Boris and I in those days labored hard but as we pleased, which was fitfully, and we all three with Jack Scott idled a great deal together. One quiet afternoon I'd been wandering, alone over the house, examining curios, prying into odd corners, bringing out sweetmeats and cigars from strange hiding places, and at last I stopped in the bathing room. Boris, all over clay, stood there washing his hands. The room was built of rose-colored marble, excepting the floor, which was tessellated in rose and gray. In the center was a square pool, sunken below the surface of the floor. Steps led down to it. Sculptured pillars supported a frescoed ceiling. A delicious marble Cupid appeared to have just alighted on his pedestal at the upper end of the room. The whole interior was Boris' work and mine. Boris, in his working clothes of white canvas, scraped the traces of clay and red modeling wax from his handsome hands, and coquetted over his shoulder with the Cupid. "I see you," he insisted. "Don't try to look the other way and pretend not to see me. You know who made you, little humbug." It was always my role to interpret Cupid's sentiments in these conversations, and when my turn came, I responded in such a manner that Boris seized my arm and dragged me toward the pool, declaring he would duck me. Next instant he dropped my arm and turned pale. "Good God!" he said. "I forgot the pool is full of the solution." I shivered a little and dryly advised him to remember better where he had stored the precious liquid. "In heaven's name, why do you keep a small lake of that gruesome stuff here, of all places?" I asked. "I want to experiment on something large," he replied. "On me, for instance?" "Ha! That came too close for jesting, but I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organized living body. There is that big white rabbit," he said, following me into the studio. Jack Scott, wearing a paint-stained jacket, came wandering in, appropriated all the oriental sweetmeats he could lay his hands on, looted the cigarette case, and finally he and Boris disappeared together to visit the Luxembourg Gallery, where a new silver bronze by Rodin and a landscape of Monet's were claiming the exclusive attention of artistic France. I went back to the studio and resumed my work. It was a Renaissance screen which Boris wanted me to paint for Genevieve's boudoir, but the small boy who was unwillingly dawdling through a series of poses for it today refused all bribes to be good. He never rested an instant in the same position, and inside of 5 minutes I had as many different outlines of the little beggar. "Are you posing, or are you executing a song and dance, my friend?" I inquired. "Whichever monsieur pleases," he replied with an angelic smile. Of course, I dismissed him for the day, and of course I paid him for the full time, that being the way we spoil our models. After the young imp had gone, I made a few perfunctory daubs at my work, but was so thoroughly out of humor that it took me the rest of the afternoon to undo the damage I had done, so at last I scraped my palette, stuck my brushes in a bowl of black soap, and strolled into the smoking room. I really believe that, excepting Genevieve's apartments, no room in this house was so free from the perfume of tobacco as this one. It was a queer chaos of odds and ends, hung with threadbare tapestry. A sweet-toned old spinet in good repair stood by the window. There were stands of weapons, some old, dull, others bright and modern. festoons of Indian and Turkish armor over the mantel, 2 or 3 good pictures, and a pipe rack. It was here that we used to come for new sensations in smoking. I doubt if any type of pipe ever existed which was not represented in that rack. When we had selected one, we immediately carried it somewhere else and smoked it, for the place was, on the whole, more gloomy and less inviting than any in the house. But this afternoon, the twilight was very soothing. The rugs and skins on the floor looked brown and soft and drowsy. The big couch was piled with cushions. I found my pipe and curled up there for an unaccustomed smoke in the smoking room. I had chosen one with a long, flexible stem, and lighted it, fell to dreaming. And while it went out, but I did not stir, I dreamed on and presently fell asleep. I awoke to the saddest music I had ever heard. The room was quite dark. I had no idea what time it was. A ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weeping quietly, and I was fool enough to cry out, "Genevieve?" She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet, and asked for Boris. I carried her to the divan and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. "I can't find Boris nor any of the servants." "I know," she answered faintly. "Boris has gone to Ept with Mr. Scott. I did not remember when I sent you for him just now." "But he can't get back in that case before tomorrow afternoon, and are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? What an awful fool I am, but I was only half awake. Boris thought you had gone home before dinner. Do please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time." "I've had a long nap," I laughed, "so sound that I did not know whether I was still asleep or not when I found myself staring at a figure that was moving toward me and called out your name. Have you been trying the old spinet? You must have played very softly." I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than that one to see the look of relief that came into her face. She smiled adorably and said in her natural voice, "Alec, I tripped on that wolf's head, and I think my ankle is sprained. Please call Marie and then go home." I did as she bade me, and left her there when the maid came in. 3. At noon next day, when I called, I found Boris walking restlessly about his studio. "Genevieve is asleep just now," he told me. "The sprain is nothing, but why should she have such a high fever? The doctor can't account for it, or else he will not," he muttered. "Genevieve has a fever?" I asked. "I should say so, and has actually been a little light-headed at intervals all night. The idea! Gay little Genevieve, without a care in the world, and she keeps saying her heart's broken and she wants to die." My own heart stood still. Boris leaned against the door of his studio, looking down, his hands in his pockets, his kind, keen eyes clouded, a new line of trouble drawn over the mouth's good mark that made the smile. The maid had orders to summon him the instant Genevieve opened her eyes. We waited and waited, and Boris, growing restless, wandered about, fussing with modeling wax and red clay. Suddenly, he started for the next room. "Come and see my rose-colored bath full of death," he cried. "Is it death?" I asked, to humor his mood. "You are not prepared to call it life, I suppose," he answered. As he spoke, he plucked a solitary goldfish squirming and twisting out of its globe. "We'll send this one after the other, wherever that is," he said. There was feverish excitement in his voice. A dull weight of fever lay on my limbs and on my brain as I followed him to the fair crystal pool with its pink-tinted sides, and he dropped the creature in. Falling, its scales flashed with a hot orange gleam in its angry twistings and contortions. The moment it struck the liquid, it became rigid and sank heavily to the bottom. Then, came the milky foam, the splendid hues radiating on the surface, and then the shaft of pure serene light broke through from seemingly infinite depths. Boris plunged in his hand and drew out an exquisite marble thing, blue-veined, rose-tinted, and glistening with opalescent drops. "Child's play," he muttered, and looking wearily, longingly at me, as if I could answer such questions. But Jack Scott came in and entered into the game, as he called it, with ardor. Nothing would do but to try the experiment on the white rabbit then and there. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see the life go out of a warm, living creature, and I declined to be present. Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder when Boris and Jack came in bringing their marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above and a cry came from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash, and the next moment he called, "Jack, run for the doctor. Bring him back with you. Alec, come here." I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Genevieve, sitting bolt upright, with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris's gentle restraint. He called me to help. At my first touch she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes. And then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looked straight into Boris's face, poor, fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our 3 lives turned into new channels. The bond that held us so long together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place, for she had spoken my name, and as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged in my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I couldn't look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you." But he could not finish, and as the doctor stepped swiftly into the room, saying, "The fever," I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street, saying Boris would rather be alone. We crossed the street to our own apartments, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of The King in Yellow and the pallid mask. I was very ill for the strain of 2 years which I had endured since that fatal May morning when Genevieve murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best," told on me at last. I had never imagined that it could become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself, although the inward battle raged night after night, and I, lying alone in my room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Genevieve. The morning always brought relief, and I returned to Genevieve and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempests of the night. Never, in word or deed or thought while with them, had I betrayed my sorrow, even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truth below, but there was no one to see except myself, and when the day broke, the mask fell again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick, but they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basin, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the King in Yellow, wrapped in the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, "Not upon us, O king, not upon us!" Feverishly I struggled to put it from me, but I saw the lake of Hali, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon, Aldebaran, the Hyades, Allur, Hostur, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the king in yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature, was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill nor so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognized, Boris among them. Afterwards they told me that this could not have been, but I know that once, at least, he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice. Then the clouds settled back on my senses and I lost him, but he did stand there and bend over me once, at least. At last one morning I awoke to find the sunlight falling across my bed and Jack Scott reading beside me. I had not strength enough to speak aloud, neither could I think, much less remember, but I could smile feebly as Jack's eye met mine, and when he jumped up and asked eagerly if I wanted anything, I could whisper, "Yes, Boris." Jack moved to the head of my bed and leaned down to arrange my pillow. I did not see his face, but he answered heartily, "You must wait, Alex. You are too weak to see even Boris." I waited and I grew strong. In a few days I was able to see whom I would, but meanwhile I had thought and remembered. From the moment when all the past grew clear again in my mind, I never doubted what I should do when the time came, and I felt sure that Boris would have resolved upon the same course so far as he was concerned, as for what pertained to me alone. I knew he would see that also as I did. I no longer asked for anyone. I never inquired why no message came from them, why during the week I lay there, waiting and growing stronger, I never heard their names spoken. Preoccupied with my own searchings for the right way and with my feeble but determined fight against despair, I simply acquiesced in Jack's reticence, taking for granted that he was afraid to speak of them lest I should turn unruly and insist on seeing them. Meanwhile, I said over and over to myself, how would it be when life began again for us all? We would take up our relations exactly as they were before Genevieve fell ill. Boris and I would look into each other's eyes, and there would be neither rancor nor cowardice nor mistrust in that glance. I would be with them again, for a little while in the dear intimacy of their home, and then, without pretext or explanation, I would disappear from their lives forever. Boris would know. Genevieve, the only comfort was that she would never know. It seemed, as I thought it over, that I had found the meaning of that sense of obligation which had persisted all through my delirium, and the only possible answer to it. So, when I was quite ready, I beckoned Jack to me one day and said, "Jack, I want Boris at once, and take my dearest greeting to Genevieve." When at last he made me understand that they were both dead, I fell into a wild rage that tore all my little convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse from which I crawled forth some weeks afterward, a boy of 21 who believed that his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day, when Jack handed me a letter and the keys to Boris's house, I took them without a tremor and asked him to tell me all. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned wearily on his thin hands to reopen the wound which could never entirely heal. He began very quietly. "Alec, unless you have a clue that I know nothing about, you will not be able to explain any more than I what has happened. I suspect you would rather not hear these details, but you must learn them, else I would spare you the relation. God knows, I wish I could be spared the telling. I shall use few words. That day, when I left you in the doctor's care and came back to Boris, I found him working on the fates. Genevieve, he said, was sleeping under the influence of drugs. She had been quite out of her mind, he said. He kept on working, not talking any more, and I watched him. Before long, I saw that the third figure of the group, the one looking straight ahead out over the world, bore his face, not as you ever saw it, but as it looked then and to the end. This is one thing for which I should like to find an explanation, but I never shall. Well, he worked, and I watched him in silence, and we went on that way until nearly midnight. Then we heard the door open and shut sharply, and a swift rush in the next room. Boris sprang through the doorway, and I followed, but we were too late. She lay at the bottom of the pool, her hands crossed across her breast. Then Boris shot himself through the heart. Jack stopped speaking. Drops of sweat stood under his eyes, and his thin cheeks twitched. I carried Boris to his room. Then I went back and let that hellish fluid out of the pool, and turning on all the water, washed the marble clean of every drop. When at last I dared descend the steps, I found her lying there as white as snow. At last, when I had decided what was best to do, I went into the laboratory and first emptied the solution in the basin into the waste pipe. Then I poured the contents of every jar and bottle after it. There was wood in the fireplace, so I built a fire, and breaking the locks of Boris's cabinet, I burned every paper, notebook, and letter that I found there. With a mallet from the studio, I smashed to pieces all the empty bottles. Then, loading them into the coal scuttle, I carried them to the cellar and threw them over the red-hot bed of the furnace. 6 times I made the journey, and at last not a vestige remained of anything which might again aid in seeking for the formula which Boris had found. Then at last I dared call the doctor. He's a good man, and together we struggled to keep it from the public. Without him I never could have succeeded. At last we got the servants paid and sent away into the country, where old Rosier keeps them quiet with stories of Boris and Genevieve's travels in distant lands, from whence they will not return for years. We buried Boris in the little cemetery of Sava. The doctor's a good creature, and knows when to pity a man who can bear no more. He gave his certificate of heart disease and asked no questions of me. Then, lifting his head from both his hands, he said, "Open the letter, Alec. It's for us both." I tore it open. It was Boris's will, dated a year before. He left everything to Genevieve, and in case of her dying childless, I was to take control of the house in Rue Saint-Cécile, and Jack Scott the management at Ept. On our deaths, the property reverted to his mother's family in Russia, with the exception of the sculptured marbles executed by himself. These he left to me. The page blurred under our eyes, and Jack got up and walked to the window. Presently he returned and sat down again. I dreaded to hear what he was going to say, but he spoke with the same simplicity and gentleness. Genevieve lies before the Madonna in the marble room. The Madonna bends tenderly above her, and Genevieve smiles back into that calm face that never would have been except for her. His voice broke, but he grasped my hand, saying, "Courage, Alec." Next morning he left for Ept to fulfill his trust. 4. The same evening I took the keys and went into the house I had known so well. Everything was in order, but the silence was terrible. Though I went twice to the door of the marble room, I could not force myself to enter. It was beyond my strength. I went into the smoking room and sat down before the spinet. A small lace handkerchief lay on the keys, and I turned away, choking. It was plain I could not stay, so I locked every door, every window, and the 3 front and back gates, and went away. Next morning Alcide packed my valise, and leaving him in charge of my apartments, I took the Orient Express for Constantinople. During the 2 years that I wandered through the East, at first in our letters we never mentioned Genevieve and Boris, but gradually their names crept in. I recollect particularly a passage in one of Jack's letters replying to one of mine. What you tell me of seeing Boris bending over you while you lay ill and feeling his touch on your face and hearing his voice, of course troubles me. This that you describe must have happened a fortnight after he died. I say to myself that you were dreaming, that it was part of your delirium, but the explanation does not satisfy me, nor would it you. Toward the end of the second year, a letter came from Jack to me in India, so unlike anything that I had ever known of him that I decided to return at once to Paris. He wrote, "I am well, and sell all my pictures as artists do who have no need of money. I have not a care of my own, but I am more restless than if I had. I am unable to shake off a strange anxiety about you. It is not apprehension, it is rather a breathless expectancy of what God knows. I can only say that it is wearing me out. Nights I dream always of you and Boris. I can never recall anything afterwards, but I wake in the morning with my heart beating, and all day the excitement increases until I fall asleep at night to recall the same experience. I'm quite exhausted by it and have determined to break up this morbid condition. I must see you. Shall I go to Bombay, or will you come to Paris?" I telegraphed him to expect me by the next steamer. When we met, I thought he had changed very little. I, he insisted, looked in splendid health. It was good to hear his voice again, and as we sat and chatted about what life still held for us, we felt that it was pleasant to be alive in the bright spring weather. We stayed in Paris together for a week, and then I went for a week to Epte with him, but first of all we went to the cemetery at Sava, where Boris lay. "Shall we place the Fates in the little grove above him?" Jack asked, and I answered, "I think only the Madonna should watch over Boris's grave." But Jack was none the better for my homecoming. The dreams of which he could not retain even the least definite outline continued, and he said that at times the sense of breathless expectancy was suffocating. "You see, I do you harm and not good," I said. "Try a change without me." So we started alone for a ramble among the Channel Islands, and I went back to Paris. I had not yet entered Boris's house, now mine since my return, but I knew it must be done. It had been kept in order by Jack. There were servants there, so I gave up my own apartment and went there to live. Instead of the agitation I had feared, I found myself able to paint there tranquilly. I visited all the rooms, all but one. I could not bring myself to enter the marble room where Genevieve lay, and yet I felt the longing growing daily to look upon her face, to kneel beside her. One April afternoon I lay dreaming in the smoking room, just as I had lain 2 years before, and mechanically I looked among the tawny eastern rugs for the wolf-skin. At last I distinguished the pointed ears and flat, cruel head, and I thought of my dream where I saw Genevieve lying beside it. The helmet still hung against the threadbare tapestry, among them the old Spanish morion which I remember Genevieve had once put on when we were amusing ourselves with the ancient bits of mail. I turned my eyes to the spinet. Every yellow key seemed eloquent of her caressing hand, and I rose, drawn by the strength of my life's passion, to the sealed door of the marble room. The heavy doors swung inward under my trembling hands. Sunlight poured through the window, tipping with gold the wings of Cupid, and lingered like a nimbus over the brows of the Madonna, her tender face bent in compassion over a marble form so exquisitely pure that I knelt and signed myself. Genevieve lay in the shadow under the Madonna, and yet through her white arms I saw the pale azure vein, and beneath her softly clasped hands the folds of her dress were tinged with rose, as if from some faint, warm light within her breast. Bending, with a breaking heart, I touched the marble drapery with my lips, and then crept back into the silent house. A maid came and brought me a letter, and I sat down at the little conservatory to read it, but as I was about to break the seal, seeing the girl lingering, I asked her what she wanted. She stammered something about a white rabbit that had been caught in the house, and asked what should be done with it. I told her to let it loose in the walled garden behind the house and opened my letter. It was from Jack, but so incoherent that I thought he must have lost his reason. It was nothing but a series of prayers to me not to leave the house until he could get back. He could not tell me why. There were the dreams, he said. He could explain nothing, but he was sure that I must not leave the house in Rue Saint-Cécile. As I finished reading, I raised my eyes and saw the same maidservant standing in the doorway, holding a glass dish in which 2 goldfish were swimming. Put them back into the tank and tell me what you mean by interrupting me, I said. With a half-suppressed whimper, she emptied water and fish into an aquarium at the end of the conservatory and, turning to me, asked my permission to leave my service. She said people had been playing tricks on her, evidently with a design of getting her into trouble. The marble rabbit had been stolen, and a live one had been brought into the house. The 2 marble fish were gone, and they had just found those common live things flopping on the dining-room floor. I reassured her and sent her away, saying I would look about myself. I went into the studio. There was nothing there but my canvases and some casts, except the marble of the Easter lily. I saw it on a table across the room. Then I strode angrily over to it, but the flower I lifted from the table was fresh and fragile and filled the air with perfume. Then, suddenly I comprehended and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The doors flew open, the sunlight streamed into my face, and through it, in a heavenly glory, the Madonna smiled as Genevieve lifted her flushed face from her marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. And we will go ahead and read we will read In the Court of the Dragon, because it looks like that's about 19 minutes, so it should take up the rest of the stream. So, In the Court of the Dragon. O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying? Mercy on them, God! Why, who art thou to teach and he to learn? In the church of Saint Barnabé, vespers were over, the clergy left the altar, the little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled in the stalls. A Suisse in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every 4th step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsignor C. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned toward the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again, and the preacher mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ voluntarily ceased. I had always found the organ playing at Saint Barnabé highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid, if cold, intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified, and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord I had felt a change for the worse, a sinister change. During vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir, but now and again, quite wantonly as it seemed, from the west gallery where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes a half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at Saint Barnabé, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the west gallery. I had read of such things happening too, but not in works on architecture. Then I remembered that Saint Barnabé was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century Rococo. But now Vespers were over, and there should have been followed a few quiet chords fit to accompany meditation while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony, but I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil! Whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns, still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monseigneur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now, at last, the preacher had made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnabé that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive which I had brought to my favorite church for healing, for I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth. They gather themselves together and lay them down in their dens. Monseigneur C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes, and passing down the gallery on his way out, I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs which descend directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistants will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here at last was the ease of mind I longed for. "My children," said the preacher, "one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it." Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Fathers. "Nothing can really harm the soul," he went on in his coolest, clearest tones, "because—" but I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I knew not for what reason, and saw at the lower end of the church the same man was coming out from behind the organ and was passing along the gallery the same way, but there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank, and yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so, me whom he had never seen before? For the moment, all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted. But in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnabé is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even colored glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that, when I was turned toward it, whenever moved at the west end, could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed, it was no matter that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was a likely place to harbor supernatural horrors. The clear-cut, reasonable face of Monseigneur C., his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. The flyaway lady, supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in the high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her gold trumpet at him and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing, and sat and chaffed myself and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monseigneur C. himself. For all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it, for the jingle in my ears of "The skirts of St. Paul has reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures more unctuous than ever he preached," keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining down on Rue Saint-Honore as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths in a gold cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn on me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me, but I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best I could into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and on to the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods, on the far-away arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of grey stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him coming, again, down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cours la Reine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across to the Champs-Élysées, and turned towards the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face, but he was not looking at me. I crept past, and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate, and still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunlight were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing: the will and the power to work me evil. In anguish, I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Garde Republicaine. He was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled. Into the Bois, and far out beyond it, I know not where I went, but after a while it seemed to me night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at the table before a small cafe. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired, so tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue du Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue de Rennes is a balcony supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side and close the ends that give on the two streets. Huge gates, swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways, close this court after midnight, and one must enter them by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects unsavory pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open on the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by iron workers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavory as it is below, there is cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the atelier of architects and painters and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fete-makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and now my refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung high up in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me, and now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backwards down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue de Dragon. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing down the court in perfect silence, but at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue de Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. Now his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were on all his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes, hopeless. I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suisse's staff in the south aisle preceding Monseigneur C. to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbor, rose also with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too, and I went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin, bent arm and its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion where I had hoped to keep it, for I knew him now. Death, and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do, and now I knew, while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a flare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away, the arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon, dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death, and that awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." And I think that's a good place to leave off for the night. I will see you on Thursday as we continue The King in Yellow. We will be picking up with the next short story in the collection, which is The Yellow Sign. So I hope you will join me on Thursday as we continue reading this public domain book that I got from Gutenberg.org. Have a nice night and have a good rest of your weekend.